Hi, it's Ramsey Dewey with the JX Fight Club in Shanghai, China. Probably the rarest injury in mixed martial arts is the depressed skull fracture of the frontal bone. It's an injury that's happened in MMA 3 times. The first time it happened to me here in Shanghai, China at the Rough Genesis MMA show. The second time it happened to a fellow in South Africa due to about 30 elbow strikes inside his guard to the frontal bone, caused a fracture. Weirdly, that guy ended up winning the fight in spite of the severe injury via submission. The third time it happened to Evangelista Cyborg Santos when he fought Michael Page. And that was highly publicized, one, because they're bigger name fighters, and two, because the injury looked much more severe. Because Cyborg has a very prominent frontal bone. He's got that really big, really deep brow. And so what we have here, I'll show you mine, or at least where you can see a bit now, is a hole in the head. I literally have a hole in my head. It's about that shape. I've got to pull my skin back because my frontal bone is not nearly as deep as, say, Cyborg's is. Okay? We've got sinuses all over our skull. We've got frontal sinuses up here. What that is a hollow pocket inside of the skull. Okay? So basically, the first layer of bone is broken. It's shattered into a spider web of fractures. So it's about this wide. It's about this tall. It includes the frontal bone. It includes the top of my eye socket. It includes part of the nose right here. So this whole side of my face was caved in. And my nose is off center now. This eye is kind of peeking this way. So I've got a, you know when you cross your eyes on purpose? Well, I kind of have to do that all the time with this eye just to see straight, while at the same time relaxing this eye. It's weird, but I've gotten used to it. So how did this happen? Now, in the case of Michael Page, MVP versus Cyborg, that was a head-on collision. Michael Page did probably the most well-timed, well-executed flying knee in response to Cyborg shooting in. And so they collided, boom, it's like a 35-mile-per-hour head-on car crash, boom. So we're gonna see some damage right there. I mean, that was legit. All right, that dude in South Africa I mentioned, I mean, the referee probably should have stopped his fight and called it a TKO and not let 30 elbows in a row land in that same spot. In my fight, here's what happened. One single punch shattered my skull. There were 2 punches my opponent threw in that fight that connected. One clipped me on the chin, put me on the floor, knocked me out. Okay, it was, you know, a legit placement of the hand, boom, right there on the chin, knocked me out. The second one, before the referee stopped the fight, my opponent came in with this big, heavy overhand, cracked me right there. Boom, snap. Not only did it cause a depressed skull fracture, you know, a nice fist-sized hole in my head right there, but, I don't even know if you can see it through the skin anymore, but I had a hairline fracture all the way up here from one punch. Who was this guy, you may ask? A fellow named Wang Guan. He's a Chinese fighter. He just got contracted with the UFC, and he's going to fight in the UFC this month. That's a historic event, actually, because when I first got here to China almost 9 years ago, nobody knew what MMA was. And explaining MMA to people was like pulling teeth. Nobody knew what the UFC was. Barely anybody knew what jiu-jitsu was. I mean, martial arts, even though China is often regarded as the birthplace of martial arts, very few people here actually know martial arts. I mean, if you know recent Chinese history, during the Cultural Revolution, the practice of martial arts was all but killed. Okay, all those old kung fu masters, the legitimate ones, either fled or died off. So there are very few legitimate kung fu masters, you know, people who can actually teach you how to fight, left in China. So man, it kind of confused me when I first came here and they said, oh, you teach American Kung Fu. I was like, well, no, it's not Kung Fu. But you know, Kung Fu doesn't mean Chinese martial arts, unless you specifically say, 中国 Kung Fu, you know, Chinese Kung Fu. Okay? Because that's what they say. They say Chinese Kung Fu to talk about Chinese martial arts. You can talk about Thai Kung Fu, speaking of, you know, Muay Thai. American Kung Fu, talking about MMA. You know, Japanese Kung Fu, talking about Jiu-Jitsu or Karate or Judo. Right? Anyway, so Wang Guan, he's fighting in the UFC. UFC is here. Big event. I'm totally going to go. And yeah, this is the guy who broke my skull. So how did this happen? Well, you know, I don't directly blame him, but I'm going to tell you, it was a matter of loaded wraps. Yes, he had his wraps loaded, and there are several ways to do that. The way he did it was with kinesio tape. Right, this is a roll of kinesio tape, sometimes called physio tape, or rock tape, or titan tape. Now, can you tell the difference between this and the perfectly legal sports tape that all fighters wrap their hands with? Kind of looks the same. This is a little wider, but again, you can get the kinesio tape in a narrower roll that looks identical to that. What's the difference? That's safe-ish. That is a weapon, a deadly weapon. So the Rannick Ultimate Fighting Federation, RUF, it was a company owned by some Canadians. They decided to make a MMA show to rival the UFC here in China. So they recruited all the fighters they could, including myself, to compete for 1,000,000 renminbi. The renminbi is the Chinese currency, the Chinese yuan. The exchange rate is about 6.4 renminbi for $1 US. So the initial tournament, the grand prize was 1,000,000 renminbi. That's several hundred thousand US. It's a lot of money. People have killed for less money than that. Seriously, contract killers have killed for way less money than that. Okay? So whenever there's a lot of money on the line, there will be cheating. There absolutely will be. There will be people taking performance-enhancing drugs. There will be people trying to sneak something into their wraps. There will be people trying to get whatever unfair advantage, grease themselves up. And when I started fighting here in China, it was the Wild West. My very first opponent, I fought this dude up in Xi'an, a guy named Amu, and this Chinese guy, very tall fellow. And I remember I ended up in the guard, and I felt pretty confident in my jiu-jitsu, and I caught him in a triangle choke, and it was tight. It was on. And Amu, he slipped right out because he was covered from head to toe in grease. Now, you have to understand, in Sanda and also Muay Thai, the fighters grease themselves up before the fight. And in a stand-up fight, that's not that big of a deal. And that's part of the sport. But in MMA, it is illegal to grease yourself up. But again, it was the Wild West. People barely knew what MMA was, let alone what the rules were. I mean, that fight, they told me, hey, it's UFC rules. And while I was trying to play guard, my opponent's throwing soccer kicks at my head. I was like, wait a minute. This is not UFC rules. This is a street fight in a ring. So, man, lesson right there. If you're fighting in a foreign country, make sure that nothing is lost in translation. So, what ended up happening, the Rannick Ultimate Fighting Federation, they told me, we are going to have an official to tape everybody's hands to make sure everything is done legitimately, to make sure nobody cheats. So I'd seen this sort of thing before. You might see that on my hand right there. What is that? That is a cast made out of tape. Just the regular sports tape. You put layer after layer after layer on your knuckles, make it nice and tight, pack it down, put that under your normal wraps, and that gives you a huge advantage as far as punching power. You can punch so recklessly. Feels like you can punch through bricks when you got one of those tape casts on, because it strengthens your knuckles a lot. All right, this is fairly common in Muay Thai in Thailand. Thai fighters do this all the time. In Sanda in China, the Sanda fighters, they do this all the time. And under the big gloves, it's hard to tell. When somebody comes in to check your wraps, when they squeeze the gloves, when your hand is limp like this, it feels soft. But when you make a fist, it becomes rock hard. Now, there have been people who try to put like coins or metal or, hard stuff under here. But when they feel your hands, you can tell that right away, right? But this, you can sneak that in. Again, this is part of the reason why the UFC, ONE FC, those big shows, they have an actual official to tape the hands for the fighters. So I get to the venue to fight for Rough Genesis. And they hand out a bag to each fighter. In the bag, there is a roll of gauze, there's a roll of sports tape, the standard stuff you tape your hands with, the legal stuff. And then there's a roll of kinesio tape. It's really stretchy, adhesive elastic, the type you make mobile casts with to put on your shoulder in case you have like a shoulder injury. You can hold a dislocated shoulder back in the socket without having to put it in a sling or put it on your knee or your thigh or some other part that's hard to wrap around. So why did they have this stuff in there? Well, it was a really stupid decision because one, they let the fighters tape their own hands. They let the cornermen tape their own hands. And two, the kinesio tape was colored. Red for the red corner, blue for the blue corner. The idea was to put it around the outside of the glove to indicate which fighter belonged in which corner. A lot of fight shows do something similar with a colored vinyl tape or a colored duct tape on the outside of the glove, okay? Which is something an official puts on after they have inspected the wraps and the gloves to make sure everything is legitimate. That keeps the Velcro of the glove in place, so the Velcro doesn't come off and scratch up the fighters' faces or cause cuts or injuries or abrasions. Okay? But there was a 50-yard roll. This is, I think, 5 meters. There's a 50-yard roll of this stuff in that bag that they just gave to the fighters to do whatever they wanted with. And so there were fighters wrapping and wrapping and wrapping this stretchy, sticky, thick, strong, adhesive, elastic kinesio tape around their hands. Now, I didn't do that because I didn't want to cheat, and I knew that was against the rules, and I had signed a contract to abide by the rules, and my word is my bond. And the other fighters did that because, well, I don't think they did it with any malicious intention. It's just in China, the tendency in combat sports is you wrap your hands with whatever the promoter gives you. I mean, I went to a show once where they gave us Scotch tape to tape our hands up with. I kid you not, a clear plastic Scotch tape. That's what the fighters had. And so that's what they used. And it was a mess. I would say most of the shows I fought in China, most of the fights I had here, it was a bring your own tape and do whatever you want kind of event. So nobody checked anything. Nobody drug tested you either. I mean, you could have got away with murder. In fact, some people have, literally. So again, I don't blame the fighters. They were just doing what they've always done, what they were always taught to do. Just tape your hands with whatever the promoter gives you. And he gave them this super strong, super illegal kinesio tape with the intention of just putting it on the outside of the glove. So my opponent, Wang Guan, he did the same thing. He wrapped up his hands in the kinesio tape. I don't know if he had this on or not. I don't know. Again, he comes from a Sanda background. He was the former lightweight Sanda champion, national champion of China, and that's kind of a big deal. That's a 16-day tournament with 400 fighters, right? And you got to fight every single day, multiple fights every single day for 16 days to win that title. So it's a highly competitive tournament. And we're talking about people coming from nothing, fighting essentially for survival, fighting to support their families and whatnot. And so, you know, it's a weird dynamic, man. It's a really weird dynamic. And these folks, they train full time. They live at sports universities like Wang Guan. He essentially lives at the Xi'an Sports University, or at least he used to. And full-time Sanda fighter at that point in his life. So yeah, he wrapped up his hands the way he always did. You know, Sanda tradition, so I imagine he may have had this underneath, I don't know, but he did have the kinesio tape wrapped around the top. Why does that matter? Why does that make a difference at all? Well, I'll tell you, if we get a piece of adhesive elastic, you know, stretchy, sticky stuff, as opposed to the non-stretchy tape, and wrap that around our hands, I mean, even the normal stuff, this makes our hands feel like hammers, right? We can punch a lot harder when we wrap up our hands. It locks the bones into place. So your hand is like a bag of marbles. We got 27 or 28 bones in the hand, I don't remember. They're about marble-sized, right? So we got these 27, 28 marbles in a sack of flesh and skin right here. And if I take this sack of marbles and I throw it at your head, boom, you know, it's going to hurt. But it's probably not going to break you if I throw just a canvas bag of marbles at you. But if I take that same bag of marbles and I wrap it up tightly with really stretchy, sticky, strong tape, you know, the type that can hold a dislocated shoulder back in the socket, and I tape that up all over, now instead of a bag of marbles that's going to shift on impact, I've got a rock solid object. So if I take that rock and I chuck that boom, at your head with the speed of a fastball, hits you right there, what's going to happen? Right? If that's got your weight behind it, if that's got some bad intentions behind it, that, my friends, can break a skull in one punch. And that is exactly what happened. Man, the frontal bone, that is one of the strongest structures on the human body. The strongest structures on the skeleton are the frontal bone, the olecranon, that's this bone right here, that pointy hook on the elbow, and the bone of the heel, right at the end of the foot. Those bones are super hard, okay? That's why, you know, you can actually bounce punches off of your head. If your opponent gets lazy with their jab and doesn't put any explosion behind it, you can kind of bait them into throwing another one, so you can counter it with your right cross by bouncing it off your head, just headbutting, boom, 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 headbutting the jab, right? And especially with the big gloves on, yeah, you can make that work out. But somebody's throwing rocks at your head, and a solidly loaded, locked fist under a small 4-ounce glove is very much a rock. An illegally wrapped hand is a dangerous weapon. So if you're going to fight, man, there is a rule in all combat sports involving taping hands. Your cornerman is allowed, according to the rules, to go backstage and watch your opponent tape his hands. And if there is a discrepancy, if there is a disagreement in how the hands are taped, he is allowed to object. Now, you yourself are not allowed to go back there and watch him tape your hands, but your cornerman is. Okay? If I could do that all over again, If I understood the dangers of loaded wraps back then like I do now, yeah, I absolutely would have had my cornerman go and watch it and voice an objection. And then I would have gone straight to the promoter and told him, you breached the contract, I'm out of here. Check your contracts, guys. If you're fighting professionally, you should have a contract with the details spelled out. And that was another thing, the promoter, Ruff, they didn't spell out the details, and that should have been a big red flag. Right? They didn't tell me on the contract who I was fighting, what weight class, what the day was, the basic information, who, what, when, where. So if your contract doesn't specify that, it's not a contract. Okay, don't sign it, don't fight for them. Okay? Fighting is already dangerous, guys. Don't make it more dangerous by fighting for stupid people who don't belong in the fight game. Okay? And I see this so much here in the People's Republic of China. People doing these fly-by-night MMA shows trying to get rich quick, basically. They put on these shows, they get anybody to come and fight for them under whatever set of rules, very poorly managed, no regard for the fighter's health or safety, and they charge a bunch of money, make a bunch of money, often don't pay anybody, and then skip town. I mean, this happened to me again when I was working as a judge for the Rebel Fighting Championships. Man, Rebel Fighting Championships. Guys, it's a MMA show based in Singapore. They've done a bunch of shows in China, however, and I had heard about them. They seemed to be a reputable company. Some friends of mine had fought for them. What my friends didn't tell me is they hadn't been paid. So a friend of mine said, hey, would you like to come be a judge for this fight show? I was like, sure. So we did the fight show, and I remember before the event, there was this kid who they hired to open and close the cage door, and somebody said, hey, the kid just skipped town because he heard a rumor nobody was getting paid. So could you open and close the door? I was like, that's weird. And when I got back from the event, back to the hotel, all the fighters were stomping around. They're all mad, like, hey man, get over here. I was like, hey, what's going on? They said, did they pay you yet? I said, no, they haven't paid me yet. What's happening? They said, nobody's being paid. Nobody's getting paid. They're trying to skip town. So what ended up happening, all these fighters, they cornered the promoter. They trapped him in the hotel, essentially held him hostage for several days, 3 days, until they finally got paid. I had to leave that night, and so they told me, oh yeah, we'll mail you the check, we'll send you the money, we'll wire you the money, whatever. And a year and 3 months later, still waiting, but they've still put on more shows. Man, there is so much corruption in this sport that I love. It's a shame. It's such a shame. The fighter's end it's sacred to me. That what we do in the gym, we dedicate ourselves to excellence. We push ourselves so much. We lift ourselves to become something better, to become something stronger, to rise above mediocrity, just to be exploited by these people who couldn't care less about those essentially risking their lives for your entertainment. And on the other end, the fighters who don't respect that process enough to abide by the simple rules, show up, keep the rules, don't take performance-enhancing drugs, don't load your wraps, don't cheat, don't cover yourself in grease. Sounds simple, but again, when there's a lot of money on the line, a million RMB, million whatever currency your country has, again, people have killed for less and they'll certainly cheat for it. Man, The guy with the loaded wraps went on to the UFC. The guy with the broken skull went on to make YouTube videos. Life isn't fair, guys. But again, it's not supposed to be. Hey, thanks for watching. Get out there and train.